Hi. So the 29th December 2015 message written to the Conference of the Continental Boards of Counsellors defines the features for this next upcoming 5-year plan, which starts Resvon 2016 and goes until Resvon 2021. And this upcoming plan is the last in a series of plans, all with the single aim of advancing the process of entry by troops. And this series of plans began with a 4-year plan in 1996, then a 12-month plan in the year 2000, followed by a series of 5-year plans that started in 2001. And this message, the 29th December 2015 message, will form the basis of the consultations of the institutions, various individuals, and communities throughout the Baha'i world in applying the provisions of the plan towards their clusters. In many ways, this message builds from the previous messages of the House of Justice and previous guidance of the House of Justice related to previous plans. Most notably, the 28th December 2010 message, the 27th December 2005 message, and then to some extent also there was a message in January of 2001 that defined the features of that first 5-year plan from 2001 to 2006. The message is kind of broken into various sections, as you see on the screen here. The first few paragraphs are an introductory section that reviews some of the accomplishments of the current plan that's ending as this message is written. And then the next 6 sections are titled by the House of Justice. And the first titled section, the emergence of a program of growth, describes a cluster from the very beginning to the point where a program of growth has emerged, and the cluster has reached the first milestone in a series of milestones in its development. The second titled section, which is strengthening the pattern of action, is a description of clusters as they're advancing beyond the first milestone towards the second milestone in their development, and kind of some of the characteristics and elements of a cluster as it reaches that second milestone, and then describes what it looks like for a cluster to reach the second milestone. In that section, the House of Justice gives a goal for this upcoming 5-year plan, the 5-year plan from 2016 to 2021. And they call for growth to be accelerated in all clusters where it has begun. And then they write that this combined effort should seek to raise the number of clusters where a program of growth has become intensive to 5,000 by Resvon 2021. So the goal of the plan from 2011 to 2016 was for there to exist in the world 5,000 clusters that had a program of growth at any level of intensity. So around the world, many communities, individuals, and institutions were striving to help the clusters move beyond this first milestone, indicating that a program of growth has emerged. And now for the plan that ends in 2021, these 5,000 clusters, the programs of growth for these 5,000 clusters need to become intensive, meaning that the cluster has reached and surpassed the second milestone in its development and beyond. The third titled section, Embracing Large Numbers and Managing Complexity, describes the development of the cluster as it moves beyond the second milestone towards the third developmental milestone. And the House of Justice notes that there are around 200 clusters in the world that are at this point. And so the Baha'i world is still learning what it looks like for clusters to move towards this third developmental milestone and beyond. The next two sections are on the topics of releasing the potential of the youth and enhancing institutional capacity, respectively. And finally, the last titled section is a period of special potency, in which the House of Justice talks about the historical significance of the next 5 years and reminds us that this is a spiritual enterprise in which we are engaged. As this message has built upon the previous plan messages, and this plan is built upon the previous plans, the message is very familiar and it's very accessible, and it may even seem a little simple, maybe deceptively simple. And the House of Justice even says that it's straightforward. They write that, quote, "The essential elements of the coming plan, like those that came before it, are straightforward," end quote. And then they go on, the next sentence is, quote, "Nevertheless, a profound understanding of its various facets requires an appreciation of the sophisticated set of operations through which a cluster develops," end quote. And I'll probably stop doing the quote, end quote thing throughout this. And so it's kind of towards that, towards this appreciation that I wanted to share just a few thoughts I had about this message, some things that I've appreciated from it. And obviously, these are just my own thoughts. And in fact, my hope in sharing these thoughts are that any listener is inspired to delve more deeply into this message of the House of Justice and all of the messages of the House of Justice, and to gain more appreciation of the language, of the flow, and of the significance of the messages of the House of Justice. So my focus for this video will be the first three titled sections, sections 2, 3, and 4, which are the emergence of a program of growth, strengthening the pattern of action, and embracing large numbers and managing complexity, which go from paragraph 4 to paragraph 33, in which the House of Justice kind of describes the development of a cluster from the very, very beginning through the third milestone in its development and beyond. And so in that fourth paragraph, so what I did was I kind of just looked at some themes that emerge in these paragraphs, and I listed the themes at the top here, such as support or service or training. And then I looked at the paragraphs, which are listed on the side here, and I just kind of looked at which paragraphs or what themes are in what paragraphs and what the flow is like. And so in the fourth paragraph, which I didn't put on this little spreadsheet, the House of Justice talks about how the unfoldment of the process of growth in a cluster has certain shared characteristics, and many of these were discussed in the 2010 message, but that a collective understanding has grown about the development of a cluster through a series of milestones that mark progress. And so then in that fifth paragraph, the very first thing that happens in a cluster's development is that people arise to support. And so often this looks like friends from neighboring clusters reinforcing the actions of a existing small Baha'i community, or visiting teaching teams and tutors who travel into a cluster to begin offering courses with some of the local people in that cluster, or even a homefront pioneer who settles in a cluster and begins activities and begins offering the institute courses. And so really the support is a major theme throughout these three sections, paragraphs 5 through 33. but it really starts with this simple yet profound support, often from outside a cluster, and then once kind of the inhabitants of a cluster who are prompted by a wish to contribute to the spiritual and material well-being of their communities, once they are enabled to begin offering acts of service, a program of growth has emerged. And so here we see that in paragraph 6, it kind of mentions this first milestone, which is where the beginnings of offering acts of service takes place. So as we'll see, these themes of support and service and training, as the paragraphs go on and as the cluster advances in its development, these themes will give rise to structures and conform to rhythms, and they're part of a profound process of transformation. So while it may start out simple, this acts of service, this support, it may start out simple, but it's really part of a very profound process of transformation. So as we go into paragraph 7, the section then starts strengthening the pattern of action. And in paragraph 7, we see that there's a nucleus of friends that have formed that are consulting together, working together, arranging activities. They're serving together. But in order for things to grow, that the number of people who are sharing this commitment must rise, and their capacity for action must increase. And so in paragraph 8, we see that one of the foremost conditions in allowing this development to take place and this growth to take place, one of the foremost conditions is an institute process that's gaining in strength. And we see that the tutors are supporting this institute process gaining in strength, and they're also helping to usher in the first cadre of tutors that are part of that cluster or part of that locality itself, who will then go on to support the growing institute process. And the participants who are taking the institute courses, while they're both being assisted and supported by tutors to proceed further through the sequence of courses and continue their study, while at the same time they're organizing co-activities, children's classes, junior youth groups, and eventually, as they become tutors, study circles of their own. And the training that takes place is that they're continuing to proceed through the sequence, but that others are starting the sequence of courses, so the number of those starting courses increases. And so all of this requires support. So we see then in paragraph 9 that accompaniment becomes very important, because the provision of training by itself doesn't bring about progress, but that really accompanying individuals, kind of working alongside them, can help build consciousness and build vision of what is possible. And the House of Justice talks about how through accompaniment, hesitation recedes and capacity develops to the point where an individual can carry out activities independently and then in turn accompany others. This support, as more and more are proceeding through the sequence of courses and more are starting core activities and other activities, this support that is in the form of accompaniment becomes more systematic. So we see in paragraph 10, the support becomes systematic, and those who have gained a measure of experience emerge as coordinators of the educational activities. So children's class coordinator, junior youth group coordinator, study circle coordinator, and that becomes a structure that emerges to help further support all those who are studying the sequence of courses and then organizing core activities and other activities. So speaking about other activities, now we go on to paragraph 11, and we see that the institute process doesn't only build capacity for educational activities, which are the children's classes, junior groups, and study circles, but also a range of activities, like, for instance, sharing and studying prayers with others, and visiting friends in their homes to share a theme from the teachings, and teaching the faith. And so this theme of support continues, and the friends need support in these activities as well. And so the structure that emerges in this case is an area teaching committee, which helps mobilize and support the individuals who are carrying out these other activities, especially through teaching teams. And here we see teaching teams as it becomes a structure of support. So at this point, there's a bit of complexity in the cluster now, and there are agencies that are emerging in order to support the friends carrying out activities, both core activities and other activities, that are as a result of their study of the Institute process. So this theme of support continues. So even these agencies need support. And so the House just talks about how the agencies emerging in a cluster need assistance as they take up their duties. And so here is where the auxiliary board members and regional institutions become crucial for offering that support to these cluster level agencies. And one way of offering support is by creating spaces in which these agencies and the believers involved can study guidance, can reflect on their actions in the light of guidance and draw insights therefrom, and also become connected with the wider body of knowledge being generated in surrounding clusters. So this is one structure that emerges to support these cluster agencies. And so now, and also, so another theme, if we look at the spreadsheet, another theme has emerged, and that is of learning. So already from the beginning, there's this culture of learning that is being fostered, where support for cluster agencies takes the shape of a connection to a wider body of knowledge. So as we move on to paragraph 13, we see that this impulse to learn through action that's present at the very start becomes more systematized and rhythmic, and there are quarterly cycles, 3-month cycles of activity that emerge, and that kind of reinforce and capitalize on this capacity to learn through action. And especially this is especially prominent in the reflection and planning phase of the cycle, especially the reflection gathering. So we see this rhythm of reflecting and planning kind of on a rhythmic 3-month basis start to emerge. And I suppose I could write that there's a reflection meeting as a structure. Reflection gathering. So now as we go on to paragraph 14, and another service that was mentioned earlier, teaching the faith, it's kind of explored in more depth, because and another concept or another theme emerges, this theme of conversations. And so the House of Justice talks about how, central to this pattern of action that's evolving in the cluster is the transformation effected through the agency of the Word of God. And this is what we see when individuals go through the sequence of courses. They encounter Baha'u'llah's revelation in a certain context, and they consider themes such as worship and service to humanity, the life of the soul, the education of children and youth, and at the very beginning of the sequence of courses, they start to develop habits of study and reflection upon the creative word. And this, of course, inevitably leads to the process of transformation within these individuals and within a collective. And this transformation is expressed through the ability to have these distinctive and meaningful conversations. And so this theme of conversations and transformation comes up in paragraph 14, and this kind of expresses itself further through this service, this act of teaching, in which these individuals who are moving through the sequence of courses and encountering the words of God and are transformed by them, they gain a capacity to explore spiritual reality with others. And this service really it extends through a large number of people. That just talks about how it extends to include parents whose daughters and sons are benefiting from the community's programs of education, through youth and their peers, and just through a community. So this particular capacity of having these meaningful conversations we see in the next paragraph, paragraph 15, it's now further systematized, and it's harnessed through another phase of this cycle that had emerged 2 paragraphs prior, which is the expansion phase. And so this is a systematic and rhythmic time to harness and stimulate this capacity for conversation. And the different aims of the expansion phases could vary. Could be from increasing the participation in core activities to directly teaching the faith and discovering receptivity and discovering readiness to enroll in the faith. And here we see again the theme of support comes back as working in teams. And it says that the approach of working in teams allows the friends to serve together, offer mutual support, and build confidence. And the Training Institute is still very central to the different phases of the cycle. In the expansion phase, the House of Justice talks about how there's a review of the relevant institute materials during this expansion phase. So as we go on to the next paragraph, we see kind of another theme come up, and this is that of working in small centers, small population centers. And the House of Justice says that in order to accelerate the growth process through a steady flow of new participants entering the institute process, that this pattern of activity in community life has to be developed in small centers of population where intense activity can be sustained. So kind of everything that was discussed from, paragraphs 5, 6, and 7, and then moving on to 8, where the centrality of the institute process is described, all the way to paragraph 15, where we have cycles of activity emerge, and we've got systems and structures of support. All of that has to be done in small centers of intense activity in order to accelerate the growth process. Because it is in these small centers of population that the interlocking dimensions of community life are most coherently expressed. And it's here that the process of collective transformation is most keenly felt. So this theme of transformation is very prominent in this paragraph, where we see how all the different kind of elements and conditions that were described from paragraphs 5 through now are all part of this process of collective transformation that can be seen and felt if it's focused in small centers of intense activity. So then in paragraph 17, the House of Justice goes on and talks about how those who are working in neighborhoods need support. Of course, the theme of support comes back, and that they must learn how to explain the purpose of the activities, and how to help the inhabitants of that neighborhood or small population center see the rich possibilities created by working together, and how to encourage them to arise to serve the best interests of their society. And so really one main way of supporting the Friends working in neighborhoods is to help build their capacity to have conversations with the inhabitants of the neighborhood. And so now we come to the point in paragraph 18 where the House of Justice talks about the second milestone. And they talk about how that if the cluster has gotten this far to the point where it's in the 18th paragraph in this continuum of development, it seems that all the elements of a system necessary for growth to be sustained are now in place. And that's this kind of bordered box here. All the elements for a system of growth are in place. And it seems like all the previous paragraphs we've just talked about include all these elements for a system of growth. And really what this, and some more support that the House of Justice mentions are that another structure here that is first mentioned, the local spiritual assemblies, helps foster attendance at 19-day feasts and at Baha'i holy days. And that there's also reaching the second milestone is accompanied by quantitative advances, which were mentioned earlier, like, for instance, a rise in the number of those in conversations and in the number of homes being visited, in core activities, and in the participation of core activities, and in the individuals that are beginning to study the sequence of courses, and in the number of individuals supporting others. And so these are all the elements that we talked about. We talked about the institute process gaining in strength and accompaniment and the capacity to have conversations. So the numbers of all these things rise, but really what it's a sign of, the House of Justice says, again, going back to this theme of transformation, it's the sign of the gradual spread within a population of a pattern of community life based on Baha'u'llah's teachings. And so we see all the elements that the House of Justice has described, starting from the very simple support for people doing acts of service, and then supporting them as they study, and then accompanying more friends in their acts of service, and the structures rising. All these, and then the numbers of all these things rising. All these advances are a sign of the transformation of a community through the teachings of Baha'u'llah. So now the next paragraph, paragraph 19, is where the House of Justice, as I mentioned earlier, gives the goal that and calls for this goal of 5,000 clusters where the program of growth has become intensive, has gotten to this point. So the plan from 2011 to 2016, the goal of that plan was for there to be 5,000 clusters with programs of growth at any level of intensity. And now the House of Justice has called for these 5,000 clusters to have programs of growth at an intensive level, at this level that was described that ended in paragraph 18, where all the elements of a system of growth are in place. And we see that there's, I guess, under this rhythm, that there are 20 cycles in a 5-year period of time, and so over 20 cycles there should be a clear arc of progress. In paragraph 20, the House of Justice reminds us of the importance of the endeavors of the Baha'i world in the divine plan, and kind of places this objective of 5,000 intensive programs of growth against the backdrop of the conditions of the world. And the House of Justice says, I'll just read the whole paragraph. We set this objective before the Baha'i world, conscious that it is truly formidable, that a Herculean labor will be required, that many sacrifices will have to be made. But faced with the plight of a world that suffers more each day, bereft of Baha'u'llah's elixir, we cannot, in conscience, ask anything less of his devoted followers. God willing, their exertions will prove worthy to crown 100 years of toil, and set the stage for exploits as yet unimagined that must adorn the second century of the formative age. So it's not really up to us. The world is at a certain point in which it needs the divine plan to move forward to a certain point in order for the world to continue to progress. And so and this is just my own thoughts and opinions, but it seems like the House of Justice really takes that into account when it sets the goals for the divine plan. It looks at the plight of a world that suffers more each day. And so one other thing to note is that in 2021 will be the 100-year anniversary of the ascension of Abdu'l-Baha in November of 2021, which is the first century of the formative age. So the formative age is the second of the three broad ages the Guardian talks about. He talks about first about the heroic age that was during the ministries of the Bab of Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Baha, in which kind of the spiritual energy of the faith was infused into the world, and through the central figures, and also through the sacrifices of the heroes and martyrs of the faith. And now during this formative age, which started in 1921 and will continue until the Golden Age, this formative age is where these spiritual forces released by the central figures and by the heroes of the faith are being used and crystallized and formed into the administrative order, into institutions, into processes and structures and systems, in order to apply Baha'u'llah's revelation to transform the collective life of humankind. So, it's kind of significant that this plan will end the first century of the formative age, and the next plan that will begin Rizwan 2021, I assume. Actually, I'm not sure. Who knows? But in the year 2021 will begin the second century of the formative age. So, and one other thing to note is that in paragraph 21, kind of the last paragraph of this section, it again reiterates this theme of support, and this time clusters can support one another. In fact, the House of Justice mentions that progress will be more swiftly achieved in regions where one or more intensive programs of growth have been sustained for some time, because these intensive programs of growth offer a valuable source of knowledge, and they represent a reservoir of human resources to surrounding clusters. And so even one cluster can support another as that cluster advances towards the second milestone, towards becoming an intensive program of growth. And one other structure here is mentioned, and that is the consultation that the counselors had in the Holy Land when this message was released for their conference. The consultations there from the World Center extend after the conference's conclusion, extends quickly to national spiritual assemblies and national agencies and institutions, and then extend quickly to the grassroots. And so, as the House of Justice mentions later, through the institution of the counselors, we have this structure that helps unite the world center with the grassroots. And so that's yet another structure that's mentioned. Okay. So the next section is embracing large numbers and managing complexity. And in paragraph 22, I didn't write anything, but it does mention that by the time a program of growth has become intensive, there are maybe tens of individuals who are active in the work of expansion consolidation, shouldering the work, and the participation in the program of growth surpasses maybe 100 people. But being able to reach out to large numbers, so mobilizing 100 people whose service connects them with many hundreds or even thousands of people, requires the capacity to adapt to a substantial increase in complexity. So not simply getting from 1 to 10 and 10 to 100, it's not the same. It's not just doing the same thing over and over, but there are actually different capacities that help someone go from 1 to 10 and then 10 to 100 and then 100 to 1,000. Okay, so in paragraph 23, kind of all the different themes, most of the different themes are mentioned here. We see that the House of Justice talks about how as the growth process continues to gain intensity, we see all these different themes. So kind of going from left to right, we see more and more homes and a growing number of tutors and cluster agencies and local spiritual assemblies who are supporting cluster agencies, all are working to support the development of a cluster and the development of the processes unfolding in a cluster. So more and more homes are venues for community building activities, and a growing number of tutors support a strengthening institute process. And all of this so that there's a multiplication of those who are walking a path of service. So more and more people are enabled to offer acts of service for their community, whether it be core activities or other activities. And that the Training Institute is at a point, being supported by a growing number of tutors, is at a point where there's a constantly expanding pool of workers, a constantly expanding pool of people who can walk a path of service and can offer acts of service and activities. And that also within the educational system of the Training Institute, children and youth are moving from one stage of the educational process to the next, and it becomes a system, an educational system. So that's the next one. We have this educational system capable of welcoming large numbers is now a structure, is now in the cluster, and it's firmly rooted. And this system of education, the sequence of courses, are cyclical. The full sequence of courses is offered each cycle. And so it becomes a cyclical educational system, a rhythmic educational system. And the capacity to have these meaningful conversations is extended to include a wide array of people. These conversations are reaching more and more people. And all of this to say that many lives are touched and transformed by these community building activities. And then the next theme, the one of working in small geographic settings, or the theme of the neighborhood, comes to focus in paragraph 24. And so here we see House just talked about how there's a core of people that are assuming responsibility in this neighborhood, responsibility for the growth and the progress of this neighborhood, and that within this neighborhood there's a broader cross section engaged in conversation, and that you see that and that these activities that were discussed in the previous paragraph, educational activities and other activities, are open to whole groups at once, such as a whole family would maybe join an activity, or a whole band of friends and neighbors, or a whole troop of youth. And then you see also this practice of collective worship become nurtured within the cluster, and I guess that's also part of the transformation that the revelation of Baha'u'llah has. And you see at this point now, the support that the friends working in the neighborhood have received over the last few paragraphs, the last many paragraphs, and now at this point, the friends in the neighborhood who have felt and seen the transforming effects of these processes are able to then, through the cluster agencies, extend this growth process to different parts of the cluster. And so now we see that the friends in the neighborhood are able to support the rest of the cluster. And that's where the theme of support comes in this paragraph. Now, moving on to paragraph 25. Again, the theme of the neighborhood is in paragraph 25, and it focuses on the receptivity that is present within distinct populations, and that these populations can be galvanized through the edifying influence of the faith as they embrace the cause of Baha'u'llah. But that and learning is mentioned in this paragraph 25. That there's still much to be learned about the dynamics of a population that embraces the faith. But that really it gets to the point, and growth can be accelerated markedly when the members of the population themselves are the ones supporting the process and are in the vanguard of such an effort. And so, and it's because they have special insights into the forces and structures in the society that can reinforce the endeavors. So here we see that there might already be structures in a place, in a locality, that that could lend that could lend assistance to the efforts underway. And so, but we might not know unless those from within the population themselves are the ones supporting these efforts. So now, in paragraph 26, going back to the structure of the Institute, as growth advances, the structure of the Institute must correspondingly adapt. And so we have additional coordinators that emerge, but not resulting in another layer of administration, but actually, if maybe some of them might focus on a particular geographic part of the cluster, and their efforts are really enhanced when they work in teams and when they call upon help from capable individuals. And then we see that as tutors and animators and teachers of children's classes, if those who are maybe living in close proximity to one another are able to meet together and assist each other, really that enhances the work of the Institute a great deal. So we see that as a structure, the Institute is advancing, but it does draw upon help from capable individuals, and that those who are tutors and animators and teachers are also supporting each other. And similarly, the area teaching committee as a structure also is rising to a new level of functioning as the number of those who are shouldering the work of expansion consolidation are increased, or the number of those connected to the pattern of activity is large. And they're gaining an ability to read the circumstances in the whole cluster, and they're asking themselves higher level questions, such as how to organize systematic home visits to the friends, or how to strengthen spiritual bonds with the parents of children and junior youth, and how to hold devotional gatherings so that hundreds and thousands of people are engaged in worship. And again, we see, though, that it's not just 3 or 4 or 5 people who are doing this, but that just like the Institute coordinators who draw on help from capable individuals, the Area Teaching Committee draws on help from individuals and collaborates with local spiritual assemblies. And so collaboration is a key element of supporting each other. In paragraph 28, we see the local spiritual assemblies are now discussed in greater detail, and they also are a structure that lends support. So they encourage universal participation, they support the Institute and the agencies of the cluster, they're attentive to the needs of new believers, they see to it that gatherings for feast and holy days and by elections become opportunities to reinforce the high ideals of the community and fortify its spiritual character. And in their efforts to support all the friends in their locality, they support and both materially and through encouragement, campaigns and reflection gatherings. And they also think about when it would be beneficial to decentralize things like feast and holy days in order to facilitate ever greater participation. So as we go on to paragraph 29, we see that that this theme of learning, which is present throughout all of these paragraphs, it's talked about now in more detail, and the House of Justice talks about how it permeates the whole community and acts as a spur to the rise in institutional capacity. So the last few paragraphs, we talked about the institutional capacity of the Institute, of the Area Teaching Committee, of the local spiritual assemblies, and that it's this mode of learning that acts as a spur to the rise in institutional capacity. I guess I wrote that there. And we see at this point that the cluster reflection gathering, which had emerged early on as the cluster was moving towards the second milestone, it's where so much learning is presented. It's now complemented by meetings for smaller areas. So again, kind of building off the previous paragraph's theme of decentralization, there are smaller meetings in which generate a stronger feeling of responsibility among those who are attending these smaller meetings. And kind of as all this is being done, the regional institutions are able, and national institutions and their agencies are able to support the work in a cluster. And the House of Justice talks about how this support is experienced as an unceasing flow of love. As we get into paragraph 30, we see that many of the themes that are listed on this little Excel spreadsheet are present in paragraph 30. So we see the service that kind of emerges as a cluster gets to this point in its development is the stirrings of social action. And this is the House of Justice as a natural outcome of the rise both in resources and in consciousness of the implications of the revelation for the life of a population. And a lot of times, the stirrings of social action arise from the institute process, from the junior spiritual empowerment process through training. But also, it could come about by consultations at a community gathering, let's say. And that this social action is a sign that that the friends are being drawn into the life of society through the conversations that over the past few paragraphs we've seen have been widening and reaching various social spaces and increasing and reaching many, many people. And one type of support that social action could receive is through a nearby Baha'i-inspired organization, let's say. And that doesn't have to be for all instances of social action. Some initiatives become sustained and gradually grow. And so on occasion, the work of these initiatives can be reinforced through an established Baha'i-inspired organization. And that the social action oftentimes comes about through work in a neighborhood, through focusing on small geographic areas, and that the forms that these social action endeavors can assume are diverse. And it really depends kind of on the circumstances and the conditions in that particular neighborhood and with that population. But all of it really represents something that a population is learning, and it's very profound. And the House of Justice says that however humble an instance of social action might be at the beginning, it is an indication of a people cultivating within themselves a critical capacity, which is learning how to apply the revelation to the manifold dimensions of social existence. So this is this idea that a population is learning how to apply the revelation. This is kind of an indication of the transformative power of the revelation and of the Word of God, the power to transform society. And so I guess before we move on to paragraph 31, I suppose this is something that I really appreciated in this message, having, just from the small amounts that I've been able to study it. Of course, I'm sure my appreciation will rise over time as I study it more with groups of people and work with groups of people to apply the message in my cluster. But one thing I appreciated was to see from the beginning, from these simple acts of support and service and training, which connects hearts with the Word of God. And as this support continues and becomes more systematized in structures, and as the service and the training become rhythmic and cyclical, and the capacity for conversation through connecting hearts with the Word of God kind of also becomes more cyclical and rhythmic. Through all of this, through all the elements that are being put in place for a system of growth, we see even from the beginning that all of it is part of this process of transformation. And so it's nice to see this flow from, I guess it's kind of a triangular flow in this spreadsheet, but from the beginnings, and then the House of Justice mentions every once in a while, more directly mentions the transformative processes that are taking place in the cluster, but that it all kind of, as we see, it all leads to, and it's all part of a process of transformation, a profound process of transformation. So finally, we get to paragraph 31, which is, I guess, where the third milestone is described. And it talks about how the House of Justice says that the movement of a population has come this far, that the process that has brought this movement about is strong enough to achieve and sustain a high degree of participation. And this is the third milestone in a process of growth. And that this third milestone denotes the appearance of a system for extending in center after center a dynamic pattern of community life that can engage a people in the work of their own spiritual and social transformation. And here's where the House of Justice says that this has come about in around 200 clusters, and that the House of Justice anticipates that this will be observable in several hundred more by the conclusion of the plan in 2021. So there are still 2 paragraphs left in this section. And the House of Justice says that, so this is now kind of moving a little bit beyond the 3rd milestone. The House of Justice says that in some of the clusters where growth has advanced to this extent, an even more thrilling development has occurred. And so this is in paragraph 32, talks about how there are locations where a significant percentage of the entire population is now involved in community building activities. And they say that, for instance, there are some small villages where all of the children and junior youth are in the programs of the Institute. So there we see that in the Institute. The Institute engages all the children and junior youth in a certain village. And we see that because of this significant kind of percentage of the population, we see that the societal impact of the faith becomes more evident. This is part of that process of transformation. And that, for instance, the figures of authority are now drawing insights from these instances of social action that has emerged in these clusters. And they're learning from the efforts of the Baha'i community in its community building. And we see that regarding conversations, that the teachings have an effect on the general discourse of the place. And this can be perceived because a significant percentage of the population is part of this kind of this elevated and meaningful conversation. And finally, we see that, I guess this is kind of a structure, but it's a structure of support, is that people that are people beyond the Baha'i community, so of course the Baha'is, but then people beyond the Baha'i community are turning to the local spiritual assembly as a source of wisdom. And so these are significant developments that, of course, are down the line in the cluster's development, but that signify the transformative power of the faith. And then finally, in paragraph 33, the House of Justice really reinforces that these clusters are seeking to understand how a flourishing local population can transform the society of which it is an integral part. So kind of all the developments to this point are towards learning about that. To end, I think I would like to read this quotation from Baha'u'llah that the House of Justice quotes at the end of the message, in which Baha'u'llah kind of reminds us of our occupation. Baha'u'llah says, "How many the lands that remained untilled and uncultivated, and how many the lands that were tilled and cultivated and yet remained without water, and how many the lands which, when the harvest time arrived, no harvester came forth to reap. However, through the wonders of God's favor and the revelations of his loving kindness, we cherish the hope that souls may appear who are the embodiments of heavenly virtue, and who will occupy themselves with teaching the cause of God and training all that dwell on earth." And the House of Justice ends by noting that the systematic efforts of his loved ones throughout the world aim at the fulfillment of the hope thus expressed by the Blessed Perfection. So I hope that this was helpful in any way, and thanks.